Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers podcast, your source for travel stories, travel destinations, and travel philosophy.
I'm Amanda.
I'm Ryan.
And we're your hosts.
Hey everybody, welcome to the show. Today we are excited to bring you an interview with Idahosa Ness. Idahosa is the founder of the Mimic Method, and if you've been listening to the podcast for a long time, you would have heard Idahosa just over a year ago. And so we spent most of that last episode talking about location-independent life, how Idahosa started his company and really set up a life for himself that balances his love of travel, language learning, and entrepreneurship. So this time on the podcast, we talk a lot more about the specifics of language learning and how it adds value to your travels, but also how the conventional way of learning languages is kind of broken in a lot of fundamental ways, and how there's better ways to do it that make it more fun, that make it easier to pick up, and just a lot more practical for someone who's traveling to a new country and wants to dive in and actually get to know the people, as opposed to being stuck in a textbook, memorizing vocab that you're never actually going to be able to practically use.
Yeah, so we're going to dive into this interview right away here. So without further ado, here's Idahosa.
We are very excited to be joined today on the podcast by Idahosa Ness. Idahosa, if you've been paying attention, was on the podcast just about a year ago where he was talking about location-independent business and language learning. And we're really excited to have him on today to talk more about the Mimic Method, philosophy, and really dive deep into language learning. But to start off with, last time we talked, Idahosa, you were in Saigon. So we want to check in and see where in the world is Idahosa Ness right now.
Right now, I am in Lisbon, Portugal.
Amazing.
How did your year go travel wise, going from Vietnam and ending up in Portugal?
Oh man! All right.
Just like a very quick question.
That's the hardest question in this interview.
Yeah, it really is. All right. Well, it's fucking. So I have a really bad memory in terms of keeping track of what happens day to day, but. I was in Vietnam at some point in my life, I think last year. And then from there, we went to the girl I was dating. We went to the U.S. I took her to the U.S. to show her around for a few months, like Texas and New Orleans and stuff like that. Then we went to Budapest. So I posted up with a 4-person team in Budapest, Hungary for 3 months. And then from there, I think I went to Lisbon in September until December. And then, I came to Lisbon, not my first time, but my first time really discovering the place in September, and then decided that I wanted to actually kind of home base here for now on. So I'm applying for residency and whatnot.
Oh, cool.
Then, but in between then, I went back to the U.S. for holidays. And then on New Year's Eve, I went to Melbourne, Australia, and was there in Australia for 7 weeks. Went to Brazil for Carnival, to Rio for Carnival in February. Then San Diego for a conference in San Francisco for 2 weeks to visit my brother and sister. And then I just got to Lisbon a couple of days ago. Okay. So there's probably a bunch of random side missions in between all that too. But for the most part, those are the big chunks of time I spent, I think.
Wow,
yeah, that's
you've
cool.
Gone all around the world, literally.
yeah, literally, yeah.
It's funny, with most people you ask that question and it'll probably be oh yeah, I went to Japan for 3 weeks, but it is a tough question for you because you've been traveling so much and gone so many places.
Yeah, I don't want to come off as an asshole or anything when people ask me that, but it really is because I've been doing this for a while, and it just, I don't know, it kind of really messes up your sense of stuff because there's just no routine and there's no kind of anchor point. And I remember back in the day when people asked me questions about where I was, I had the schedule of school. 9 months of the year I'm in one place, and then there's the summertime, and I'm oh yeah, that was after my 7th grade, and then my 10th grade this happened, and there's a certain rhythm that happens, but then you just move around every few months. You're in a different hemisphere. In Australia is summertime in December, and I don't know what summer and fall means anymore. So it's just really confusing. That's actually why I decided to come to Lisbon, because I feel I don't know. I feel the human brain has not evolved just to handle this type of variation.
Yeah.
So a little bit of routine helps me find sanity.
Yeah. So was it a craving for a bit more structure that ended up making Lisbon kind of feel like a home base?
Yeah, so I had decided at some point last year that like I needed to have a home base where I can establish a routine and structure to focus on getting stuff done, because I have a lot of projects and ambitions I want to accomplish, and you can work while traveling, but you definitely get way more done when you don't have to like figure out logistical and other details every time you change location. So I was looking for a home base, but I was very picky with it. And then when I came to Lisbon in September, I was like, this place checks off all the boxes I need. So I'm just going to make it this and like really commit to it. So I'm applying for residency, getting like a 1-year lease on an apartment. Maybe I'll like, knock somebody up and get a baby. That way I can't go anywhere. And just something to ground me into a place so I don't get ADD and like oh, Denmark, and then just wander off.
That's awesome.
That seems like the least complicated way to really settle and ground yourself.
Just to have a baby. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because we kind of just started like, I don't know, location independent entrepreneurship or digital nomad life, or whatever word you prefer, in October, and I had this really like romantic idea of what working and traveling looked like, and I was like, shit, I can't get any work done when we're constantly on the go, because I'm way too tempted by like fun things to do and cool people to meet and good food to go and try, and then it's like, oh right, it's 9 p.m. and I've done nothing today.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's like nobody just pays you if you do nothing either. It's like you've got to work for that.
You got to do stuff, yeah. And I always get like, I saw some photo the other day for something, and it's supposed to be inspirational, but it was like a guy on like a rock-faced cliff looking off into the ocean with like a desk and a computer. And he's like, freedom. I'm like, it's not freedom. You have a computer and a desk. You don't go to rock faces with a computer and a laptop. Like, like you should be going there with like hiking gear and really enjoying the moment. And then you go back to your, office space and do work when you need to do work.
Yeah.
So, so I mean, I'm definitely, there's no way I can ever stop traveling. One reason why I chose Europe is that, whenever I get the itch to go someplace, I can go to a completely different culture or country within like a 2-hour flight and be back, by the end of the weekend.
Totally.
And still get back in my routine. So I'm still gonna be traveling, and I'll probably spend like, 6 to 9 months a year here in Lisbon, and then go on some adventures someplace new, for like 3 months. But the idea is that when I do that, I'm limiting the amount of work I'm doing and just really focusing on getting the most out of that location. Because when you half-ass both travel and work, then it sucks.
Yeah.
So you want to go all in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm curious, just because we've kind of been on this adventure as well, like what were the things that you were kind of looking for in a location to call a longer term home?
Yeah, a couple of things. So it's funny because I had this bit of like it's like first world problem, existential crisis thing back in August. Of like, I can't find a place that could be a home base because all the places I like being in, like Saigon, for example, you mentioned earlier, they all had deal breakers for me. So some cities I really enjoy, like Saigon, the deal breaker was the quality of the air and noise environment. So it's just really loud and hectic, and increasingly more polluted. And I'm pretty sensitive to those factors. So that didn't work for me in Saigon. So Saigon, I got a lot of work done, but it was just affecting me health-wise. Meanwhile, like Rio is another favorite city of mine. I can get a good like workout, healthy lifestyle there, but I just party too much, and there's just too many like things going on. So if I want to work, like I hate working in Rio. It's like it's the worst thing ever, because everyone's just outside dancing out the window and like playing drums. And you're just like bright. The sun has a big smile on his face and is like dancing samba too. And like, it's just, and then you're sitting there miserable in your office. So Rio, I'm like, all right, I'm only going to come here for like a few weeks a year on like carnival and party. So I need a place that's a good environment and like makes me happy as a human being, but not so happy that I don't want to work. And so Lisbon was like the mama bear for that, where you get a lot of the cultural and like visual and kind of beauty elements you get in Brazil, but it's way more like chilled out, and people are more serious. So so when I came here, I was like, this has everything I need. Great quality of life. I like to take walks and wander around a lot here. That helps me clear my head. Do audiobooks, come up with ideas. So I can get a routine here, but then still feel like I can break it by going into nature and to the beach or to the mountains and It's a good scene of people here as well. So yeah, Lisbon is just kind of had everything I needed in terms of my checklist of life needs.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then good internet as well?
Yeah. I mean, it's just as fast as anywhere else in Western Europe.
Nice. Awesome.
So jumping into language learning, something I saw in your newsletter a few weeks ago was the phrase, and kind of the approach to language learning that you kind of put out there, and the difference between learning a language and learning a people. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that difference.
Yeah, so what I always try to communicate to people is that a language is just a tool, right? And you can't get caught up in the tool itself. And that's what people do when they're like, oh, what's the preposition and the conjugation and the tense? They're focusing on the actual like tool of language and how it works and its ins and outs, but losing sight of why you even got that tool in the first place, which was to communicate and connect with human beings from a different culture, from a different place. And when you focus your energy on the actual people, then that changes your approach entirely. So in the case of the mimic method and how we approach learning a foreign language, let's just say I speak Portuguese already, but if I did it and I come here to Lisbon, and one reason why I like Portugal is because I like Portuguese people, right? So I want to make Portuguese friends, but it's kind of difficult to do that if I can't communicate with them in their own language, right? So that tool of Portuguese is what I use to make Portuguese friends and build Portuguese relationships. And then when you think about it that way, then it doesn't really make sense anymore for you to spend your time all day looking at grammar textbooks and memorizing all these different theories, because when you do that, you're not interacting with human beings. But let's say I just want to make friends with Portuguese people in their own language. And I go out there and I talk to Portuguese people every day, start conversations, go to like different meetups, whatever. That's the actual process of learning the language, because each time I do that, I'll learn new expressions, learn new words, learn new little cultural tics and ways of getting to people and stuff. So yeah, that, the actual method, we go more into detail on how you can tactically do that more effectively. But the top level idea is just talk to people, because that's the only way you can connect to people, really.
Yeah, I really like that, the idea of that method. I remember the first time that I was traveling, I didn't speak any language other than English. I mean, I dabbled in French in school because I had to take it, and a little bit in Spanish, but definitely not at a level where I could communicate with anyone. And feeling like it was kind of sad that there was all these experiences of connecting with other human beings from another culture because I couldn't talk to them. Like, I'm like, they have cool, interesting thoughts. They have, intellectual things to say. They have stories they could share with me. Yet, we have this barrier between us from communicating these things because we don't speak the same language. Exactly.
I always use the analogy of, I always say, like, a language is nothing more than like a big inside joke. And the experience of, you're sitting with two friends and then they're just like, yeah, that reminds me of that time that Johnson did this with the cow. Oh, and they all start laughing, but you don't know what they're talking about. And, but they're just bursting out hysterical laughter at this inside joke. And like, what is like the most basic human feeling you have there, which is, oh, who's Johnson? What do you do with that cow? And like you want to get in on the inside joke. And it's the same thing what you just described. You come into a foreign country and people are living their lives, making all these sounds, laughing hysterically, and you're like, oh man, like, what's going on? Can I join?
Yeah.
But you can't if you don't know the language. So that's really the core motivation to learning the people who succeed in learning a language. That's the core motivation. There's this group of people that they want to get in on their joke. They want to get in on their culture and their understanding. So you got to push through all these sound barriers to get there on the other side and laugh with anyone else.
Yeah, so when you were saying that about the inside joke, it reminded me of a couple experiences traveling where you'll get together with, maybe for one, like you're on like a tour bus or something, and you're on the bus and there happens to be like a whole gang of German people and you're like the only English speakers and everyone's speaking German. There's something kind of like instinctual about you that feels like, I don't know if it's like unsafe or something, but you're just like, oh, this is weird. I'm like the out guy.
Yeah, I mean, humans are social beings. This is very, very core to our programming. We respond very well to our groups that we're in, and we could respond very negatively to outside groups. And you see a lot of that going on today. But that's very easy to do when you have no idea what that outside group is saying, you know. So that tribalistic spirit of the human being, you know, when you learn a foreign language, it kind of expands the tribe. So you're on that bus with the Germans. If you're able to join that conversation, you're part of the crew. You're part of the wolf pack, you know, where it's just, you know, it's really core instinct. And anyone who's listened to what you just said can probably relate to that same experience of being somewhere, everyone's speaking a different language, and you just feel left out. That sucks. Like, it's the worst feeling, you know. So we're just trying to battle that feeling, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting too talking about that, because we interviewed a couple for the podcast who are traveling with their toddlers, and their toddlers are 2 and 4 right now. So their 2-year-old doesn't, I mean, he communicates a little bit with like some broken words, but he communicates a lot through like body language and actions and that sort of thing. The 4-year-old is, you know, completely fluent English speaker, and they were taking their children to schools in Indonesia and Cambodia and other countries in Southeast Asia, and watching their 4-year-olds feel like frustrated when she couldn't understand the children. Like, she was like, I want to know how to talk to them. Like, I want to talk to them in their language. Like, she understood that they were saying something different, and she wanted to speak to them in their language. And I thought it was so interesting that this is like an innate thing even in children. Like, it's not just in us as adults when we've developed these egos. Like, that happens as little kids.
Yeah, I mean, that's the compulsion for us to learn our first language. So that 2-year-old, he's watching the 4-year-old and the parents, you know, have a good time, and then that's why he's like, gaga, blah, blah. What is he trying to do there? He's trying to jump in with whatever tools he's got, you know. And you know, I take cues from kids when I learn foreign languages, like whatever tools I got, whether it's body language or a couple of, you know, barely intelligible sounds, but I'm pointing to stuff like, you know, I have the blue, you know, then, you know, that's how you do it. And yeah, so you watch, I have nieces now, and nieces and nephews, and I always just watch them when I get a chance to get ideas for like more language learning products, because you just see them and they just so much want to be part of the action. And so yeah, like, you know, this 4-year-old child of your last guest, I guarantee you, if she left her in Cambodia or Indonesia for a while, that frustration she feel would drive her, or I'm not sure it's a daughter or a girl, but it would drive that kid to learn the language. And they will succeed with it at that age because they don't have the same baggage that we adults have that get in the way of us. And, you know, the main thing for us adults, like, you know, you guys travel someplace and you speak English, there might be expats there, you have each other. And even though you're not allowed in that German bus inside joke or the Cambodians inside joke, you got your own inside jokes to like fall back on. Whereas like the 2-year-old and the 3-year-old, they got nothing but their own inside of their own heads. So they're like, they have 2 choices, like be alone the rest of their lives or learn language, you know? So that's a really huge motivation that we adults don't have that kids do.
Yeah. And the incentive is there. So they're completely motivated to learn it.
Exactly.
So when your goal is to learn the people, what are some of the issues with the conventional method of language learning? The like idea of like, oh, I'm going to assemble all the vocab and how to conjugate everything and go on Duolingo, etc.
Yeah. So one thing I've been talking about a lot recently is the difference between kind of mechanically assembling a language the way you described versus organically developing it. So human language, like humans themselves, develops organically. So imagine if you wanted to make an adult, right? You wanted to make an adult human being. You can't Frankenstein it and like get a bunch of body parts and arms and like mechanically assemble it the way you would a robot. No, you have to start with like an egg, a baby, and then the baby's like a little weird, kind of weird looking version of an adult, but then it slowly morphs into an adult over time, right? And that's how language works. In the same way, look at that baby speaking the language. They're not conjugating verbs and looking at like charts and prepositions and be like, this is the algorithm for constructing a sentence in the third person singular. First I put the preposition, you know, and like, no, they're just like blue. And then they're like, I want blue. And it's like blue candy. I want blue candy. I want to eat blue candy. You know, and over time it starts to get more refined. So in the mimic method, we advocate that approach where you start off very Tarzan, just listening to people, mimicking, using the tools. But if you open up that feedback loop and you listen to how native speakers are expressing themselves, bit by bit, you start to refine the way you speak. And be like, I I would have said it this way, but this guy over here who's a native said it this way. Let me mimic it. And then now I speak more like he does, you know, where the traditional way of sitting down, learning how to read and write first, learning what the grammar rules are. And then essentially you're kind of making this calculator program in your head where you're like, okay, these are the vocabulary words I've memorized. These are the grammar rules I've memorized. Let me plug in these vocab words into these grammar formulas. And then on the other side of the equation is a sentence I need to speak in this sentence, in this context. And that doesn't work. And then people were just sitting there like doing math problems in their head when they're supposed to be like, you know, connecting with a human being in a conversation. So this is what goes on. People end up learning to read and write decently enough because you could just sit there and look at a piece of paper and run algorithms until you get your sentences out and translations, but they're not able to have a conversation. They can't understand native speakers when they talk naturally and fast, and they can't express themselves fluidly and confidently in that context. So that's the main kind of difference between the two.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that you say that because as we've been talking about, you know, children learning and the way that we learn when we're younger from kind of babyhood, toddlerhood into adulthood, do you have any, I guess, like theories or insights into why most language learning programs have not gone this direction? Because when, you know, as we're talking about this, it's like, well, this makes so much sense. Why would we not apply the principles of how we learn our first language to how we learn our second, third, fourth, fifth language?
Yeah, so the main reason for it is because the organic way of learning, the way children do, requires mimicking, and specifically mimicking sound. And the problem for adults is that they have trouble processing sounds outside of their native language. And prior to the creation of our program, at least in the commercial market, there was no systematic way for someone to learn sound, to learn pronunciation. If you go to any learning program out there, look at the section on pronunciation, and it's really half-assed. They'll be like, you know, how do you pronounce this? It's like, oh, it's kind of like this. It's kind of like the sound in the word chicken, but not really. But anyways, it's good enough. Let's move on. You know, and then like,
it's funny because it's like an extreme example, but a lot of pronunciation books, like especially if you buy those like tiny guides to a language, it's like that. It's like, it's kind of like this, but it's not really like this. And you're like just left with like, I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, okay, exactly. You're like, fair enough. And then you go on, and then, you know, so if we talk about that, if I could continue that organic analogy, when you grow something organically, you need to have like the core elements, like the genes or whatever, the cells. And sound is the core thing. When we're having a conversation right now on this podcast, I'm just making a bunch of sounds. And you and I come from the same general, you know, North American sound category. So your ear and your mouth is pre-formatted to these sounds as a result of learning it through your, you know, childhood. But now you want to learn Portuguese, you want to learn Chinese, and you have a whole new set of sounds, a whole new set of like genes and DNA to like figure out. And before coming up with my program, there was just no effective way to teach that. So the insight from MIM method came when I realized that the challenge of teaching pronunciation is a physical challenge. And it's the exact same process that a musician goes through when they learn how to play a musical instrument. You're just coordinating physical movement with sound. So I adapted techniques because I played music my whole life. I adapted techniques from the music education world to the language education world. And I say, okay, this is a specific sound in Portuguese that people struggle with, the sound. There's a physical production going on in my mouth. If I can teach someone to understand what that is and then have them do a couple of drills to get used to it and, you know, acclimate their ears to it, then they'll get that piece of DNA and they'll get that cell. And then when they go into the real world speaking to Portuguese people, they'll recognize that sound with their ear and be able to reproduce it with their mouth when they're mimicking. See what I'm saying? So this pronunciation and sound is the core to this process of mimicking. So if a program can't teach you that, then they can't even continue on this track of learning. So they have to do an alternative, which is like, all right, well, we can't teach sound, but we can teach you prepositions and conjugations. So we'll just stay there, you know? So it's kind of like sticking to what you know instead of what you need.
Yeah, it's also interesting too because I feel like one of the challenges you guys probably have is that people have grown accustomed to the conventional way, so that's like what they think they need and probably what they want to like pay for in a way. I know I taught English kind of in like a very brief period of time, and it was like I'm trying to apply some weird ideas, but everyone kind of just wants to show up and like me to give them some like conjugation things, and I'm like, let's go out on the street and try to like talk to random people. They're like, no, not into it.
Failed business number one.
Yeah, and that expectation is actually shaped from just the global education system, where we associate learning with reading. And you're like, oh, I want to learn something. Let me read a book on it, right? And let me learn what it's about. But the thing about a language is not like memorizing the capitals of all the countries in the world. It's not just a memorization game. It's a skill. You can't learn how to ride a bike by reading a book on rotational physics, right? Like you could read it till your eyes bleed and learn everything you need to know about physics, and still never know how to ride a bike until you get on a bike and start riding. It's an intuitive skill, and the only way you can learn intuitive skills is by doing them and doing them the right way. So that's the things that wouldn't, unless you have experience learning like a skill like dancing, music, or a sport, if people who have not done those things as adults, they don't have a sense of what it takes to learn a complex ability. The only thing they have is what it takes to like learn concepts or learn, memorize vocabulary and all that kind of stuff. So that's why all the programs are geared that way, because people have an expectation for learning that way. And they have a bit of a fear for the kind of failure-based learning that's necessary to learn a new skill. The education system teaches you that like failure is bad and you can't make mistakes, whereas the real world teaches you that failure is the only way of learning and mistakes are the only way of learning,
Yeah, definitely. I think there's some really great points to touch on in there. And I was just kind of thinking about how it's really interesting how people sort of categorize language learning different from something like learning a sport. Like it seems so obvious if you were like, hey, I want to go learn to play hockey. So you know that you have to learn how to skate and, do drills with a puck, holding a stick, and you have to understand the way that the team dynamics work. And so the best way to do that would be to go play hockey. Nobody's going to question you about that. But it seems like if you're trying to learn a language, somebody's like, oh, you should go take this online course, or you should go, take this course at this college or something like that, or you should go do something that's more textbook based instead of just go out and speak it.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the issue too is that it's kind of weird kind of paradox with language, where in the hockey example you gave, it's a physical thing and we see the physicality of it, and we don't see the need to use words to explain what's going on. You just kind of move your body. Speaking and listening is itself an activity of movement. There's things moving in your ears when you're processing sound, and of course there's things moving in your mouth when you're speaking. It's a physical activity just like hockey, but we don't think about it that way because the opposite of like concrete physical reality is like the abstract kind of theoretical world, which we humans understand through words and language. So it's kind of weird because even though speaking is a physical thing, language itself is how we understand the abstract world. So when we go to learning a language, we're like, oh yeah, there's abstraction there. And that's where grammar is an abstraction. There's no, if I say to you, I has a cheeseburger, that's ungrammatical, but it's not because you ran some computer program in your head and came up with some like calculation, like the subject does not agree with the verb in number, it just didn't sound right to you. The same way that if you're playing hockey and you see someone going for to score something, what direction to go because you just have an intuitive feel for it. So these intuitive things are learned by really putting yourself out there in the real world and physically feeling it. But people make a difference between language and everything else because language is the language of, understanding and making sense of abstract things.
Has going through this process of kind of picking apart the way we learn languages Has it changed your view of education generally?
I wouldn't say it's changed because I've always had like a negative and like skeptical view, but it's definitely enhanced. It's definitely given me more wood in that fire. I mean, I as an entrepreneur, and the reason why I chose this career path is because it had occurred to me that when I was like 19 or 20, that I've always done well in school, and I kind of staked a lot of my pride and on my ability to get high marks academically. And then one day I realized that like who cares? After school, like no one cares about your grades, and I felt pretty stupid just for ever thinking about that way. So I was like, all right, I need to prove to myself that like I'm actually like truly smart, or that my brain can be put to use in any kind of effective way to survive and thrive by creating value for other people. So that's what entrepreneurship presented to me. And for the several years I've been doing this, I've learned that like there's a bunch of other ways to learn that are way more effective than sitting in a bubble and just reading a bunch of books out of context. Don't get me wrong, I read a lot of books, but now I have an actual context of life to apply the information to. And I think that really is the process of learning, where in your introverted form, you're at home just like kind of getting knowledge, getting ideas, getting things to practice, but then you go out there to the real world and test it out and see what works, see what doesn't work, and develop your like intuitive feel of what does work and how to navigate on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. For me, it was such a I guess like a lead domino, where it's one of the first things. So after college, one of the first things where I really had this experience of falling in love with learning something again was trying to learn Spanish. And from that point, you kind of just realize like, oh, this was like such a painful, unenjoyable experience in school, and it's like so fulfilling and so enjoyable out. And then you kind of just start opening your eyes to a wider and wider perspective, and just seeing like, oh, this whole thing is just taken all these things that could have been valuable and enjoyable and kind of made them boring and useless in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you need to have like a motivation, and that's why I say like don't learn a language, learn a people. Like, what is a motivation to learning a language? It's not just to know it; it's to be able to connect with certain people. And so, whether it's language or anything else, there needs to be some sort of connection between the theory and whatever you're learning to the real world application as to how it improves your life. So, learning is the most important thing anyone can do. It's just that in these academic contexts, they don't do a good enough job of tying it back to each person's individual kind of motivations and how they can use that information to improve their life.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So speaking of applying it, let's say someone at home is listening and they have a trip coming up in a few months to a country that maybe isn't covered by the Mimic Method's existing language courses. Let's say they're going to like Russia or something like that. How would you apply these ideas into kind of, I know obviously like briefly and like surface level, like approaching learning Russian in like a couple months?
Sure. So the overarching framework we have for learning a language has 3 stages: capacity, conversation, and command. The first stage, capacity, deals with hearing and pronunciation. Second stage, conversation, deals with understanding and speaking. And then the third stage, command, focuses on reading and writing. So if I were learning Russian and I didn't have that information, the first stage of capacity is building my raw physical capacity to hear Russian sounds and pronounce Russian sounds. So that's what we do with our courses. We try to make it more accessible, but a person can do it on their own as well, just kind of deep diving on their own. So I would look up, videos on YouTube in Russian, Russian music or whatever, and then use a free software like Audacity, which allows you to kind of slow down audio and play around with it the way you play around with like a Word document. And what you're doing here is you're not focusing on knowing what the Russian person's saying in the recording. It's not about what it means. It's about how it sounds. So you're listening to it in slow motion and be like, what are these sounds that this person's making? Can I get my mouth to pronounce it? Can I get my ear to differentiate between sounds? If you look up different pronunciation resources, you would go to Wikipedia and type in Russian phonology, Phonology. This breaks down the entire sound system of Russian. It'll give you a list of all the elemental sounds of Russian and what they are. So you can kind of do that. And this is what I did to come up with my programs and how I learned the languages I learned. I just took a significant period of time to like really deep dive into the sounds, listen to it very closely until I had a capacity to hear the sounds and pronounce the sounds. Then once you have that, the next stage you go into is a conversation. And this is the part that everyone's avoiding because they get nervous about it. But you just got to jump into the cold water. And you can use websites like italki, italki.com to find language partners. And just, like I said, start connecting with Russian people. That's the whole end goal in the first place. And through that process, learn new expressions, learn little cultural habits. I usually recommend a program called Pimsleur to get the basic vocabulary and grammar you need. And I recommend it because it's audio-based. So you don't want to introduce reading and writing at this stage because it can actually alter the way you hear and get in the way of your ability to understand people. That's why I save reading and writing for the end. But you do italki, you do Pimsleur, and then if you just focus on having a conversation on a regular basis, in italki you can set up free conversations like 30 minutes a day. And then each time just, review what you did, try to add a couple more words in. That process will take you very far. And most people do not do this. Most people will use like an app like Duolingo or Rosetta Stone and accumulate a lot of theoretical knowledge on the language. But like we said before, there's no real world application of it. But if you actually have real conversations with Russians, and then even better yet, if you go to that country and immerse yourself in the language, try to make friends, try to meet people that way, then this is how you learn. Now, the major thing that kind of stops people at the beginning stage is not having enough to say. So our kind of hack around that is we use scripts or routines to get you into it. So I'm sure you guys know when you go to a new place, people always ask you, what do you do? Where are you from? And, why are you here? Those kind of conversations you can anticipate happening all the time. So if you practice it ahead of time and prepare it, that routine, the same way a comedian would prepare a routine before going on stage, you can get very easily on Fiverr someone to, help you translate a script from English or whatever your first language is into that foreign language, get someone else to record it, and then just kind of memorize the script, go out to a meetup, go out to meet someone in Russia or whatever, and then just be like, hey, my name's Idahosa, I run the company, blah, blah, blah. And like, oh, wow, this guy's so good at language. You just nailed that intro. And then they start speaking at you really fast and then you don't know what they're talking about, but you just got to pretend like you do. And
yeah, so what happens? I'm sure you've got some funny stories of getting into situations like that where someone thinks you're like completely fluent and you only actually know like 45 words.
Yeah, so people always have that objection as well, like, oh wait, but if I do that, then people will think I'm way better than I am. And it's like, yeah, but there's two ways you can look at it. When you have a really strong accent and you're kind of messing up your first impression, people are not going to want to speak to you as much. And it's just a simple fact of life. If someone comes to you in the street with a really strong, accent, and it's just really hard, like, hey, hello, me want, me, and like you'll be nice about it and like help them, but like you're not gonna like, hey, let's get dinner later tonight so I can, struggle to understand you for 3 hours, So, but when you give a strong first impression, like, oh wow, this guy's one of us, it really shapes the whole future interaction. So getting someone with a bad impression of your language to like speak to you in the language as you get better is really difficult. Getting someone who has a very strong impression and to be like, wow, you're really good, and they start rattling off at you like, hey, listen, buddy, I'm actually a beginner, so do me a favor and like speak slower. It's night and day difference. So like, oh yeah, sure, and then they'll speak a bit slower, but then speed it up a little bit, and it doesn't matter. You don't need to understand everything. It's just the exposure to like real conversations with people who are at ease. They don't feel like they need to, dumb anything down for you. that is more than anything accelerates your progress to the point where you actually can understand everything that person is saying and engage the conversation. That is the end goal. So you want to like create those situations as much as you can, and the script is your best tool in doing that.
Yeah, it's kind of like one of those situations where I'm reminded of like the idea of learning a handstand, and I definitely don't know how to handstand, but that like you can't actually like practice doing a handstand until you've like managed to get yourself up there. And if you just waste all your time trying to get up there, you never actually get to practice it.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting with that analogy as well, because coming from a background of somebody who can handstand, it's like if you spend all your time trying to get up, you waste all your energy, and then you get up and you have no energy left to keep yourself up.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you want to kind of just like put yourself in there with someone hold your legs, and then, you know, they walk away, and you're going to fall a bunch of times. But once again, that's how you learn. Like, you need to put yourself in the situation. The analogy I use is kind of sink or swim. You know, if someone throws you into the deep end of a pool, you know, that's the only way you can really swim. You need to be able to be someplace where your feet don't touch the ground, and then figure out how to stay afloat. However, to get to that position in the first place, sometimes you need like floaties or like a kickboard to kind of get you to that part of the ocean. And it's actually not good at metaphor, because in the ocean, like if you can't swim, you just die. But in this situation, you might die of embarrassment, but you know, that's just part of growing up in life, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess
so
if you had like a really bad,
just swallow it.
If you got the wrong person to translate your script for you, and there's like something really offensive in there.
There you go. Yeah, there's always that risk. So make sure you get a second opinion on your scripts before you try them out on people.
Yeah, I'm curious what type of information or like what type of advice you get for somebody who's like, okay, this is great, but like, you know, I'm only going to Russia for 2 weeks. I don't really want to like, or feel the need to be like completely fluent. I just want to be able to sort of, you know, find the bathroom, get a grocery store, find the train station, say like please and thank you. Do you have the same suggestion for them, or?
No, not so much. So if a person's goal is just to do like a 2-week vacation in a place, and they don't have any desire to connect with people, it's just more like the location is a backdrop for what their vacation is, then yeah, like I said, language is a tool, and what's the purpose of that tool? The tool is to connect with people. So if you don't have a desire to connect with people, then there's no reason to buy in that tool at, you know, the store. So you can use in that case, I just say get Google Translate and just type in like, hey, where is this train station, and show it to the person. Just buy a SIM card with data and Google Translate. Boom, problem solved. You don't need to learn language. It's a waste of time. But what I will say is that as someone who's traveled and been to a lot of places, you know, what really makes places interesting is the people. And yeah, you can see cool architecture and like learn history, but you'll inevitably get to that feeling of like being left out of the inside joke. Like, oh man, Russia looks so beautiful, and this you know, Moscow looks so cool. There's all this history here, but like I feel like I don't really know anything because I can't talk to people about their lives, you know. And that's where you start to feel the language. So very often people are like, oh, I just want to go and check it out. But then they fall in love with the place, and then that's where the motivation comes. So I definitely recommend that no one goes about learning a foreign language until they have a really strong human-centered motivation, because, you know, anyone who's done this knows it's not easy. Even if you have the right method, it takes a lot of hard work. And to get through that hard work, you need to be really motivated. And the only motivation that really lasts long term is that motivation we discussed at the beginning of the podcast that, you know, the 2-year-old kid has, and, you know, Ryan had on the bus with Germans, just, you know, being left out. So yeah, that's my answer to that question.
Okay, yeah, that's cool.
Something I do think people underestimate and overestimate. Underestimate just how satisfying it is to go through this process of learning a language and just seeing yourself interact with reality, and like you making these weird noises and it's like working and people are getting it. Like it doesn't take too long to get to that point. So people overestimate how hard it is to get to that point, and underestimate how enjoyable it is to get to that point.
Yeah, the process is great. Like that's literally the number one reason why I learn languages. The first language I learned was Spanish, and I remember I was like 18 in Mexico, and once again, you just there's always people making all these different sounds. They're pretty much aliens to you because they're just like rah, 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 just making these sounds that make no sense. And I remember I had like a host family, and there's this guy like Pedro who would just be saying stuff, and like everyone would burst out laughing every 20 seconds. I'm like, there's no way Pedro's funnier than me. Like, I don't believe it. Like, and then over time, I'm learning Spanish, and I'm progressively understanding more and more. And then I come back, I can finally understand what Pedro's saying. I'm like, Pedro's actually really funny, and like and just that process of having an entire population of humans go from being like alien foreigners to being brothers and friends and like lovers is like there's very few experiences in life that really measure up to that, how meaningful and satisfactory and rewarding that is. So like you just need to get a little taste of it, and then you'll be hooked.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And then something else that I found through learning Spanish is being able to understand those foreign sounds that people are making. Like, say you get off of a bus and you're in, a tiny little town in the middle of Bolivia, and there's like taxi drivers that are kind of talking amongst one another. It can be really scary and overwhelming, and you can kind of feel unsafe. But when all of a sudden you understand the interactions that are happening, and you understand the conversations that are happening, it's not so intimidating and unsafe feeling, because you know what they're talking about. And you're not creating some sort of script in your head or some sort of story in your head about what they're talking about.
Yeah, I had a post on this before about it was like really philosophical about the battle of in every human of fear versus love, and like fear originates from misunderstanding, fear of the unknown, whereas love comes from familiarity and empathy. So like that experience, the taxi drivers, when you don't know what they're saying, there's an unknown element there, and then that elicits fear inside of you. But when you do know what they're saying, and they're just talking about how like their kid got straight A's yesterday, and they're just like the nicest guys ever, and like, oh wow, what a nice guy, and then that's where love kicks in. And yeah, your story reminds me of one time I was in Rio on the beach with some foreigners, and this guy came up, and I think he had like a mental handicap or something, so he had like a weird way of speaking, and he had like blood coming off his elbow, and he was like kind of like saying something to us, and the foreigners I was with got like super scared. They thought he was like going to rob them or whatever. But I was the only one who spoke Portuguese. And the guy was just saying like, "Oh man, I was going fishing and like I got the fish hook in my elbow." And I'm like, "Oh, sorry, buddy." He's like, "Yeah, it's all right. I'm just gonna go clean it up." Like he was just like the nicest guy ever. But these people were just like losing it. They thought they were about to get like robbed. But he's just a nice dude, And and the only difference there was language. I knew what the guy was saying. They didn't. So exact same experience, but completely different perception. One's a fear-based, one's love-based, and is all based on understanding.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's so interesting. It's also interesting to think that if for some reason that guy was not just like a chill dude and he was actually somebody who was, trying to do something wrong, it's like you still understand that, so you can actually, justify that fear and maybe like protect yourself accordingly. Like I feel like being able to understand just puts you in a position to, really be able to connect, whether or not it's, connecting with that person on a deeper level or providing some sympathy or empathy, or actually being like, yo man, it's like not cool for you to be here. Like you need to leave.
Exactly. I mean, basically there's no downside to understanding people. There's no negative side to learning foreign languages.
Yeah, I guess it just can interfere with your like projections on reality. If you just created some elaborate scenario where everyone's against you or something.
If you want to defend that aspect of the paranoid aspect of yourself, then maybe you should not learn a language.
If you're like
you might be disappointed.
If you're like making horror movies about being in foreign countries or something, it might mess with your creative process.
You want to stay inspired. Yeah, exactly.
So one part of the building the ability to understand produce and understand the sounds in another language that you guys use is music. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how music is part of the mimic method.
Yeah, so music is actually just another tool we use because, we talked before about learning skills like hockey or riding a bike, and any physical skill or intuitive ability requires a lot of repetition for it to stick in the deeper part of your brain. And music is the only form of like repetition that's, doesn't get boring after a while. So, for example, if there's some sound in Spanish that you're struggling with, maybe like the r sound or whatever, if you just sat there alone in your room and just said r, 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 like, you know, for like 2 hours, you'll eventually, you know, that's good for you, but it could be very boring. So people aren't really inspired to do that. But we put like a funky little like reggaeton beat, like, you know, and then you make these kind of like musical tutorials, and people will get really engaged and engage different parts of your brain. You get more excited. So that's how we use music in the program. And specifically what we do in some of our courses is we take song lyrics, we break them down syllable by syllable. You can see a video of like a native speaker's mouth articulating each syllable, go really deep dive into the elemental sounds and the pronunciation. And when you learn each syllable and each movement, you piece them together bit by bit, you know, line by line, until eventually you have a whole song lyric committed to memory. And then with that memorized song lyric, every time you're like taking a shower or like, you know, stuck in traffic or walking down the street, you can sing that song out loud and actively develop the motor coordination in your mouth, actively develop the hearing patterns in your ear. So that's the vehicle we use to help people train these skills, is music. But it's not so much to say that like you need music to do it. It's just that adding music makes it way more enjoyable and way more effective.
I think a funny example of kind of like the power of music for language learning that we've had come up recently in our life is we have a friend who works at an international school in Macau, China, and they're teaching to a class of some kids are European, some kids are Canadian, some kids are Chinese, Hong Kong, all over the place. And they have one student who's the class is taught in English, one student who's ESL, and the worst English-speaking student in there is kind of this like chubby Chinese kid.
Super cute,
but terrible at English. But I guess he loves Snoop Dogg, so he can say like perfectly, smoke weed every day, and then switch perfectly, and then switch back into like the terrible broken English. And they were telling us this story, and it's like, wow, that's like such a powerful insight into the way that these things work when you're not like trying to go through this complicated method and just like letting it naturally happen. He clearly has the ability to get it.
Yeah, I had the exact same experience. The day I came up with the method, I just had like a sudden surge of inspiration, and I came up with a technique for teaching people how to sing songs like "Smoke Weed Every Day" with like a perfect accent. And so I did. I rushed back home and like came up with a bunch of kind of materials, and I ran out into the street and I found random Brazilians, and I would teach them it's like random English lyrics, but I wouldn't teach it to it word by word. I teach it syllable by syllable using that technique I just described a few minutes ago. And it was so I would get these Brazilians, some of which had no English background, to pronounce these English phrases with like a near perfect American accent. But I remember it was super interesting because I remember doing it with one person, and I didn't tell them what they were saying. I was like, yeah, just clap along and like sing along. And then there's one person, she was saying it perfectly with a perfect accent. Then she recognized what she was saying because she had learned English before. And she's like, oh, and then she said it again with a super strong Portuguese accent. So when she didn't know what she was saying, so she was able to do it. But as soon as she knew, then she started thinking about how it was spelled and like what she learned in school, and all those bad habits from like her many years of learning English traditional way kicked in. So when a person, like you said, like that Chinese kid, his inability to, when he speaks broken English, you know, some of that might come from just not being able to make the sounds, but actually a lot of sounds people can already make. It's just that people were taught wrong, so they build all these bad habits.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
That's such an interesting story. It's like she connects all of a sudden, like, oh right, okay, I actually know this word, and then switches back to saying it with an accent. It makes me think of like studying Spanish in high school from a native English speaker. And it's, you know, like obviously if I go to Mexico, my Spanish accent is going to be atrocious because I've never learned Spanish from anyone who's a native Spanish speaker.
Yeah, I would never do that. I mean, I tell people, I'm like, listen, like you take my courses, I'm just an English guy. I'm just showing you how to mimic the natives, but your real teachers are the native speakers. I'm not your teacher. I'm your guide. The teachers are the the people you're trying to connect with. They'll teach you everything you need to know.
And so what do you, I know, I bet a lot of people have probably started off down the conventional journey to learning a language and now kind of have all these bad habits and, mispronunciations going on. Do you have any thoughts about how to kind of like get back to the foundation and start again on a language you've already kind of learned some bad habits with?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is, all right, let's just compare an adult, speaking specifically on pronunciation, an adult, they already have, let's just say, English as their first language, and now they're learning Spanish. So what they've done is they've developed speaking patterns, certain kind of circuitry and pathways in their brain to deal with the sounds of English. Compare that to a child who has nothing. It's just blank slate. And then they're learning Spanish, and there's no unlearning that needs to be done. So whether or not you're an English speaker who studied Spanish in school for 5 years, or you've never studied any Spanish, in either case, you need to like backtrack and like not so much unlearn, but just build up new pathways for Spanish. So the person who has that kind of baggage, they'll have a little bit more work to do, but we're all doing the same thing. So that's why the course is the same for everybody, whether or not you've been studying for years or you're brand new, because it's less about unlearning habits and just bringing in the new ones. And then when it comes to your speaking, one thing we do that's really useful for people who already have habits, the habits are on the words. It's like that Brazilian girl I told you about. She was able to pronounce the sounds, but she had this association between a specific word and the way it's pronounced. So you just have to go through and audit it. So if you go to like Wiktionary.com and search like the 1,000 most frequently used words in a language, and then just read through each word out loud, and then have someone point out all the words you're mispronouncing. If you've done our training and you know what the overall pronunciation should be like, you're going to be like, oh, wow, I never realized before, but I'm mispronouncing it that way. And now that I've taken this method course, I can explain how that pronunciation works, So, yeah, just kind of figuring out the things, just those common words you say all the time and what you've been mispronouncing. And yeah, this is bad habits. If you try to get good at public speaking, for example, and you watch your first speech, you're like, oh, wow, I have all these weird verbal tics I do. Let me just dedicate some conscious effort to not saying and ah all the time. It's the same thing.
Yeah. It's interesting because when Ryan was going through the mimic method, I was at a point where, I'd done Spanish in school. I'd done a little bit from, I guess, like while I was in Spanish-speaking countries, which had been definitely the most helpful learning. And then I'd done Rosetta Stone, Duolingo, like kind of these like traditional, conventional ways. He's like singing along to songs, and he's like, you really need to try this. And the biggest thing I noticed was that learning Spanish from somebody who actually spoke the language and going through and learning the different ways to pronounce is you actually have to learn a different way to put your tongue. And I think that that's like the biggest thing that I was missing between, okay, like La Manzana es Verde, repeating off Duolingo a million times, and then actually breaking it down, like, I guess, like syllable by syllable, and being like, oh, I actually can't pronounce this right if I use my tongue in the spot where I speak English.
Yeah. Everything. That's what I was saying before. Like when you use words and language, you can get very abstract and then forget that everything comes from a ground level reality. Everything I'm doing right now, no matter how complex these ideas I'm articulating are, is still made by like my tongue just smacking against my gums and my jaws. It's a very nasty biological anatomical process going on. So you can trace a lot of top level problems of like, I really can't understand Colombians when they talk fast, to very ground level things like, maybe it's because I'm not placing my tongue in the right position when I make the T and D sound, and you make that little twitch. And we get it all the time. I get emails all the time from people who are like, wow, I've been doing the course for 2 weeks and I already understand people way better. And they didn't learn any. My course doesn't teach any vocabulary. They're not learning words. What they're learning is that foundation and freeing up their ears so they can bring in the information and understand more. and freeing up their mouth so they can express themselves more.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting too if you kind of think about your experiences, say you're a native English speaker, and anytime you've interacted with somebody who's English second language, and thinking about, sometimes you're interacting with people, they're definitely speaking English, but their English is like every second word you're like, what? Sorry, what did you say? Because you're not hearing it as the English that you speak, that you're, the way that your brain processes those words. And it's kind of thinking about how when you speak a second language, that's how you're coming across as well, unless you're actually practicing placing your tongue in the position that they place their tongue in.
Exactly. And you recall earlier I said that overarching framework of capacity, conversation, command. Basically, there's 3 aspects to language: hearing and pronunciation, understanding and speaking, reading and writing, right? The first word is the input, reading, understanding, and hearing. The other one is the output, speaking, pronunciation, and writing. The traditional model does it backwards. They start you with reading and writing. And when you start with reading and writing, the problem that happens is you start applying your own native language kind of system of thinking about sounds and how you write them to the next language. And that messes up your pronunciation and hearing. So then when you get to the stage of trying to understand people, you can't understand them and you can't speak with them. But it makes sense if you think about it. Before you can understand someone, you first need to be able to hear them. If I went into Mexico right now with like my noise canceling headphones, I can't understand them, not because I don't know Spanish, just because I can't hear what they're saying, right? Mm-hmm. So I need to take the headphones off and actually let the sounds come into my ear first. And by that same token, if I try to speak to people with like an apple in my mouth, I'm like, hola, ¿cómo estás? Like, I can be a perfect writer and like really good at Spanish on paper, but no one's going to understand me because I can't pronounce the words. Pronunciation comes before speaking. So yeah, traditional approach, they focus on reading and writing first, and translation in the hopes that when you get to a conversation, maybe it'll transfer. It doesn't. And then they're like, oh, what about accent? It's like, oh yeah, just say that for the end. So when I tell people what our business is, we do pronunciation courses. They're like, oh, okay, so it's for advanced people who already speak the language. I'm like, no, it's for everyone, especially beginners who want to speak the language, because you need to start from the physical ground level and then work your way up, and not the other way around.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting too because, and we want to be mindful of your time. So I'll just add this before we kind of wrap this up.
Yeah, no worries.
But it's interesting being an English native speaker, learning a bit of Spanish, coming back from South America, and then going to travel other places and kind of looking at words that are in a language that's not Spanish or English, and thinking about how my brain tries to pronounce them, like tries to sound them out, because I learned how to read by sounding things out. And so it's really interesting to kind of just see the way that we learn and how we do that, and how if you tried to pronounce these words that you've never heard before in a language that you have no idea how like the phonetics work, it's really almost impossible to like figure that word out.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the last language I learned was German, and I always make a point to follow the model clearly. I should have a basic conversational fluency before I teach myself how to read and write, which sounds crazy to people, but once again, just look at what kids do. How many babies do you know are like reading newspapers and before they can have a conversation? And that's because writing is based on the conversation. And if you can, what are you doing when you're reading? There's a voice in your head that's talking to you, right? But if you don't already have that voice there, then what are you doing? So for German, the writing system is like almost completely opposite of English. And so it just screws your brain up when you're trying to learn German, like how to hear and pronounce German at the same time of reading and writing it. For example, the letter V is pronounced the way F is pronounced in English, and the letter W is pronounced the way V is pronounced in English. And when I hear foreigners speak German, they're just making these mistakes all the time that have nothing to do with not having the sound in the language, because most German sounds already exist in English. Their mispronunciation is based off of the fact that they saw the word written down and they're reading it out loud as if it were English. And it's just an unnecessary complication that could have been completely avoided if you just focuses on the audio before you started prematurely introducing the whole reading and writing element.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
Super, super interesting.
So, Idahosa, where can people go to find out more about the Mimic Method and connect with you online?
Sure. mimimmethod.com. It's where we have our blog and a growing list of free resources. I also encourage people to check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/mimic method. I've been doing like a live video every day for the past several days, and going to continue that practice for a while.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So you can check that out. And yeah, those are two places that I recommend people go to. And I guess YouTube as well.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and just from I subscribe to a lot of newsletters, and yours is one of my favorite ones to get. So for anyone,
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, of course. So for anyone who's listening, if you want to learn some more about languages and the Mimic Method, definitely subscribe to that newsletter.
Sweet.
All right. Thanks so much, Idahosa.
Thank you.
So we hope that you enjoyed that interview with Idahosa as much as we enjoyed partaking in it. He's such a cool, down-to-earth guy who has really, really got a knack for languages. And so something that we're really excited to share with you guys is that we are affiliates with the Mimic Method. Ryan has used the Mimic Method and had a lot of really good success with the language of Spanish, and I've just done a couple of the lectures, and it's really taught me, as I said in the episode, how to change where I actually place my tongue in my mouth, which is huge for sounding like a local.
Sounds kind of creepy, though.
It's not that creepy. But anyways, if you would like to check out the Mimic Method via our affiliate link, which we would appreciate, you can head on over to www.theworldwanderers.com/the Mimic Method. As always, thanks so much for listening.
To find more information, relevant links, and photos talked about in this week's episode, check out theworldwanderers.com.
If you have a question, comment, or feedback, send us an email at info@theworldwanderers.com. Join our community on Facebook at The World Wanderers or on Twitter at WorldWanderers1. As always, thanks so much for listening.
Have a great day.
Bye.